Welcome. My name is Christina Getby, and I am your science teacher. Today we're going to talk about natural selections for today's live session. So we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so natural selection is going to take us hopefully about an hour. So we'll talk about natural selection for about 15 minutes, and then some Q&A for another 15 minutes. Talk about some vocabulary, some unit vocabulary that's very important to the topic of natural selection. And then we'll talk about some more open kind of discussion platform where you can get your questions answered, hopefully. Just some things to pay attention to. Please participate. We'll be asking different questions throughout the next hour. So you can either speak using your microphone or type me a little message and it will appear as a chat. Please pay attention to your surroundings. If it gets noisy, if the dog starts barking, please mute your microphones so it cuts down on the distractions for everyone listening. These live sessions are recorded, so if you have to duck out early, so you're not able to watch the entire session, you can go to the American Academy YouTube channel, and there's the address, and you can get on and watch the different sessions. So when we're talking about natural selection, it could become kind of a touchy subject, but remember to keep an open mind. My job as an educator, as a teacher, is to give you all the information I can so that you are able to make an educated, informed opinion of natural selection. So the learning objectives for today, we are going to explain the concept of natural selection. We are going to talk about the two different requirements for natural selection, and we're going to talk about artificial selection, how it can be beneficial as well as harmful. Hi, Tony, how are you? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we can't hardly talk about natural selection without Charles Darwin. Some say that he was the most influential biologist of the science in general. So in 1831, he set sail as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. And this ship sailed from England, where Darwin was from, to the South American coast. And during his journey, he recorded observations about the plants and the different animals he saw. He recorded notebooks full of observations. He collected many different samples of the different species. And he was amazed at the variety of life on the Galapagos Islands. Again, he summarized his findings and observations in field books, in diaries, and he later published the book called On the Origin of Species in 1859. It was from that work that the idea of evolution through natural selection came to be throughout all of his findings. And so one of the big important vocabulary words that we're going to talk about is natural selection. And this means that organisms with the traits that are best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. Okay, so you can see a little picture of the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are actually made of 13 different islands. And so throughout his trips to the Galapagos Island, Darwin started noticing the variety of birds. And what came to be known as Darwin's finches, they thought to be traveling from the South American coast and kind of were swept off from their migration route due to strong winds. Some of them died, just were blown out to sea and died, and others were spread out amongst the 13 islands of the Galapagos Islands. So these finches were different on each island. They became isolated from their own from their population and started evolving into their own populations based on the islands that they were. These different populations had to adapt to the various environments. And one of the main adaptations that Darwin noticed was the shape and the size of their beak. Due to the various environments, they had to figure out and adapt how to eat, on how to eat. So some of the finches that he noticed, they developed stronger beaks for cracking nuts. Some of them actually developed finer beaks for picking insects out of a tree. And then one species even involved in using a twig in its beak to probe for insects within rotting wood, which is pretty fascinating. So again, each small adaptation gave a comparative advantage so that the characteristics would spread throughout the population. The advantage meaning they were able to eat. And so the interesting thing about these finches is they, excuse me, they evolved and adapted very quickly. So throughout Darwin's journeys, he could see them developing the different beaks in order to survive. So here's some examples of the beaks that Darwin noticed. You can see that some of the finches had very strong, very bulky beaks, if you will. So the one in the center had the great big bulky beak for cracking seeds. The one up to the right with buds and fruit kind of had like a parrot's beak, where the top of the beak kind of had a curve to kind of pry things open. You could see the thinner beaks, the one underneath was grubs. So again, a very thin beak to kind of reach into trees and get out those insects. And then the fascinating one, the tool-using finch that adapted to actually hold a twig in its beak to get the insects out. It's pretty fascinating. So all of this variation proved something to Darwin. He noticed that that natural selection was taking place. In order to survive, these birds had to adapt. So again, there's variation in nature, and the birds would lay many more eggs than would actually survive. So therefore, there is a struggle for life, which is where these favorable variations would be passed on from generation to generation, and the unfavorable variations would be removed. So if we go back to the beaks finches, if let's say the birds in the center with the thick bulky beak is on an island that has to feed on seeds, a thin grub beak is not going to be able to crack those seeds. So the thinner beaks would be more of an unfavorable trait. So they would be they wouldn't be passed on. They would kind of disintegrate basically. And then the bulkier beaks, the stronger beaks would be passed on from generation to generation. And so this leads to evolution, in which he thought he could define as descent with modification. So modification being some type of adaptation to what they already have. And then we would get a formation of a new species. And in the Darwin's finches, we would get multiple populations. So here is an example. Again, most of this information is taken right from your natural selection chapter in biology semester 2. So this picture was in there as well. I really like this picture because it shows what is going on within a population. So the first group of deer or elk, we can see that there are a lot more offspring than will actually be able to survive. So this is entitled as overpopulation. And then the second is variation. We all have variation within each species. So within this elk herd, there's different variations. There's different colors, there's different sizes, there's different antler sizes. And then the third is the selection, where some individuals are going to survive longer and are going to be able to reproduce more than others. And then finally, number 4 is the adaptation, where the traits of those individuals that are going to survive and reproduce will become more common in the population. Okay? And within an elk herd, the antlers are pretty significant in reproduction. So that's pretty interesting. Okay, so Darwin came up with these 4 principles of natural selection. So the first one is differences or variations are going to occur among the individuals of a species. So each individual of a species is going to have some sort of difference, have some variation. The second one is variations are passed on to the offspring. Number 3, some variations are helpful. And these individuals with helpful variations are going to be able to pass those down to future generations. And then over time, the offsprings of individuals with the helpful variations will make up the population and eventually will become a separate species. Remember that a population is all of the members of a species living in a particular area at a particular time. So if we look back at Darwin's finches, a population of a certain amount of a certain type of finch is going to be all those finches living at a certain island at a certain time. Any questions so far? Okay, feel free to stop me if you have any questions throughout the presentation. I'd be happy to answer those. Okay, there's also a 5th principle. Sometimes we'll see this as an additional principle, or sometimes it's just kind of implied. So it says that all species are going to produce more offspring than will survive. This allows for the best suited offspring to have a better chance of survival. So if we have, so let's go back to the elk population. So if we have some smaller elk in this picture, they are not going to be able to outrun, let's say, the wolves that are around. So that's more of an unfavorable trait. The larger elk are going to be able to run faster, so they're going to survive. Also, the elk with the larger antlers are going to be able to survive as well, because the antlers are kind of a status symbol. The bigger antlers, the bigger the elk. And so the female, the cows, will see it that way as well. So personal note, so I and my husband, we used to live out in Idaho. We lived just on the outskirts of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And Jackson Hole is home of a elk refuge. And every winter they will bring in pellets to help the population of the elk. And they will feed the elk on this population. It's quite fascinating. And over the course of the time that they've done this, they've seen many elk with chandelier antlers. And I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they're very interesting. So we would have one antler with all the tines pointing up like a normal antler would. And then we would have one that some of its tines were pointing down, hanging like a chandelier. Well, the cows didn't see that as a strong individual, so they would not reproduce with that male. And so a lot of the time, most of the time, those chandelier elks, the chandelier antlers, weren't a favorable trait, so they got lost because they weren't reproducing. Whereas the bucks with the great big antlers, all the tines pointing up, those were the ones that would be reproducing, and those antlers would be passed down from generation to generation. So it's very interesting. It's a very amazing organization that they have out there. So if you get some time, you might want to look up the elk refuge in Jacksonville, Wyoming. It's kind of cool. So, okay. So more offspring than will be produced than will survive. Okay. So for example, again, this is taken just from your lesson and from your assignment the 5.2.1 assignment. So imagine that there are brown beetles and green beetles where you live. The beetles have had babies all year, but many are eaten by birds. Pictures show a progression of what occurs. Which do you think the birds prefer to eat? So the circle on the left is early on in the year, and then the circle on the right would be toward the end of the year after the birds have eaten. So which color of beetles do you think the birds would prefer? Well, if we look at the series of pictures, we're going to notice that in the first picture, there are about half green, half brown. In the middle picture, we have all brown except one green. And then in the very last picture, we have all brown. So that shows us that the green beetles are preferred by the birds that are eating them. Okay, there are two requirements within natural selection. There must be a variety within the population, and then there must be a selection that takes place by the environment. Excuse me, got a bit of a cold, so pardon me. It's the differences within the species that are going to allow for survival for the ones that are selected. Okay, so looking at the beetles again, let's go to that image, those three circles. So in this population, the color is a variation. We have brown beetles, we have green beetles. So that's where the species has the variation. The predator or the bird is going to prefer to eat green beetles. Why? Don't know. Maybe they taste better. Maybe they are easier to see and easier to prey upon. But the selection is going to be the birds eating the green beetles instead of the brown. So we have the variation is going to be the color, the two different colors, and then the selection is going to be the birds eating the green, causing the brown beetles to survive and reproduce. So another example is going to be the peppered moth of London. Again, this is part of your assignment as well, but we'll talk about that assignment once we get there. So the trees in London were a lot lighter in color before the Industrial Revolution started. And so we had a population of moths that had their own variation. We had darker moths, we had lighter moths. These variations were going to lead to some of the moths fitting better into their environment. The lighter colors would be better suited for blending in with the tree, making it very difficult to prey upon. Whereas the darker moths, once they landed on the tree, they were easier to spot by the prey. So during this time, the lighter moths were able to survive and reproduce because they were able to blend in where the prey was not able to find them. And they were able to pass along their traits of being lightly colored. So the population of lightly colored moths only grew and increased. So here's some examples. So on the left, we have before the Industrial Revolution, where we can see that the trees were light and so were the lighter moths. And you can easily see which one would be easier to find when you're flying or even walking by. So then we have the Industrial Revolution, kind of changed the environment. So within the Industrial Revolution, coal was being used a lot more. And coal is very dirty and produces a lot of soot. soot, sorry, not soot, soot. And it was used as one of the top fuels within the revolution. So the soot would travel all throughout the environment, and the trees nearby the industries started becoming very dark, very dirty, very covered in this soot. So as the trees became darker, the situation for the moths kind of flip-flopped. So with dark trees, the lighter moths were actually easier to spot and easier to prey upon. The darker moths were able to blend in. So, okay, here again on the left-hand side, we have before the Industrial Revolution where the trees were lighter. So the lighter moths were able to camouflage a lot better. And then on the right side, after the coal was being used and the trees became dirty, they became darker, where the darker moths were able to camouflage and be hidden for survival. So as a result, the birds were able to prey upon the lighter moths at this time. So then the darker moths were able to survive and pass on their traits for darker moths. Okay, so let's go over activity 5.2.1. There are questions that we've already talked about, but we'll go over them throughout this short segment. Okay, so again, there are two types of beetles, those that are brown and those that are green. The beetles have had babies all year long, but many are eaten by birds. The pictures show a progression of what occurs. So again, we have similar pictures to what we saw in our presentation. So going from the left to the right, what is the variation within this example? Any ideas of what the variation, the difference is between these two beetles? Well, we can see, as the picture shows, we can see that the variation, is going to be color. We have several brown beetles and a few green beetles. So the variation is going to be color. Number two, which beetle is selected for according to natural selection theory? So which one of these beetles is going to be selected for the natural selection theory? Basically, what species is going to be able to survive to pass along its traits? Well, we're going to say the brown beetle because the birds are eating the green beetles. So in order to answer the first question of number two, which beetle is selected for, according to the natural selection theory, it's going to be the brown beetle. The brown, and so what would happen to each color of the beetle? The brown beetle is going to be able to reproduce, passing along that brown color variation, and then the green beetles are probably going to die out. Okay, number three. Again, we talked about this already in our presentation, but this is taken straight from our assignment, which is 5.2.1. And so the peppered moth is found in England during the Industrial Revolution. Coal was used as a top fuel during this. The problem with coal is that it's very dirty and produces soot. This soot begins to cover trees. Eventually, the trees will become darker, as the picture on the right shows us. So use the data below to explain what happened. So here is our data. So the percentage of each type of color in the population, we have in 1848, we have 98% that are light moths, and we have 2% that are dark. Okay, well, after the Industrial Revolution, we have a switch. In 1895, we have only 5% that are light and 95 that are dark. So in the peppered moths, scenario, what is the variation between the moths? Again, the variation or the difference is going to be the color. We have the lighter moths and we have the darker moths. And so the selection in the pepper moth scenario, what is the selection going to be? Any ideas? Well, the selection within this peppered moth scenario, it actually kind of switches because the selection is going to mean what moth is actually going to survive. So before the Industrial Revolution, the selection was going to be the lighter moths were going to be able to survive. And then after the revolution, we were able to see more of the dark moths being selected for survival. Okay, so then the last question on this assignment, what do you think would happen to the population of peppered moths once coal use decreased and the trees no longer were covered in soot? So once the coal stopped being used and the trees were no longer dirty and covered in soot, what do we think would happen? Any thoughts? Well, over the course of many years, after the coal was not being used and not covering the trees would begin to lighten up a lot more. And so it's asking for what would happen to the population of peppered moths. Okay, so the peppered moths, the population would go back to being lighter because the trees themselves were going to be lighter in color. And so the lighter moths were going to be able to survive a lot easier, where the dark ones were going to stand out. Okay, any questions so far? I feel like I'm talking really quickly, so please make sure that you stop me with any questions. Make sure you send me a chat or send me an email with any questions. I'd be happy to answer those. Okay, so again, in biology semester 2, within natural selection, we talk about artificial breeding. And artificial breeding or artificial selection is when we take those principles of natural selection and we actually apply them to an animal or species. So a lot of this artificial breeding, artificial selection is done by humans because we want to eliminate an undervalued trait. So for example, dogs. Dogs all came from the wolf, but over time, humans wanted dogs that were friendlier. They wanted different sizes. They wanted that cuddly appearance, those teddy bear looking dogs. Those traits were selected over other traits. And then those traits were then allowed to be reproduced in great numbers to make everyone happy. Here's where we got the different dog breeds. So it's quite interesting. Farmers and breeders allow this process to occur. They are going to take only the plants and animals with the desirable characteristics to reproduce. Okay, it's kind of causing an evolution of farm stock, okay, and ranch animals. So here we have the artificial breeding because the people, instead of nature, select which organisms are going to reproduce. So for example, if we are talking about farmers and ranchers, since their money, their income relies a lot on their organisms, cows are bred to produce more milk. Those lower producing cows their traits will kind of be gone to the wayside, and then the cows that are able to produce more milk would be reproduced. Horses, they're bred to be racers. You obviously don't want a slow horse out there. Plants are going to be produced to produce bigger yield. And then dogs and cats. A lot of dogs and cats today, everybody wants that hypoallergenic, the non-shedding fur or hair, if you will. So to fit the desire of the community, the dogs and cats are bred to be hypoallergenic. Okay, so obviously there are some drawbacks, as with most anything. There's some negative aspects due to the behavior of artificially breeding. There's an increase in diseases, mutations, infertile offspring, and unhealthy offspring. Okay, so in your biology course, you've talked about gene mutations. So when you are artificially breeding, you're going to have a lot more of those mutations, those disorders, and thus causing unhealthy offspring. Okay, so here we're going to talk about the Unit 5 review. So I'm going to exit the PowerPoint for just one moment. And I'm going to go here. So let's go through and answer the questions on Unit 5, Natural Selection. So what are the two requirements of natural selection? Our choices are variation and selection, cells and variation, variation and cells, and cells and variation. So considering three of those options are the same, what do we think the answer would be? Just do process of elimination. The answer for the two requirements of natural selection are variation and selection. We have to have a difference, and we have to have a population or an organism that's selected for reproduction. Okay, number 2, lizards have different sized leg bones. Longer bones allow the lizards to climb up during flooding to avoid predators. What is the variation? Okay, so my choices are pores on skin, different sized leg bones, skin color, webbed feet. So again, if we use our study skills, we can use process of elimination. So if you read the question again, lizards have different sized leg bones, longer leg bones allow the lizards to climb. Okay, so there's no mention of pores on skin. There's no mention of skin color, and no mention of webbed feet. That leaves us one option, which is the second one, different size leg bones. Okay, that's the only variation that was mentioned in this question. All right. Any questions so far? Okay, well, don't forget to shout out if you do have any questions. So number 3, artificial selection only produces favorable traits. So again, typically the humans are taking and artificially selecting different traits that they want to be passed on. So this is true. Yes, artificial selection only does produce favorable results, for sure. All right, number 4. Over time, individuals with helpful variations will reproduce unfavorable traits, survive and reproduce those helpful variations, become a new species, or die off. So again, helpful variations are going to be what are going to help them survive in order to reproduce. So what do we think? Reproduce unfavorable traits, survive and reproduce those helpful variations, become new species, or die off. We've talked about in our presentation. So over time, the individuals with helpful variations are definitely going to survive and reproduce those helpful variations. So their offspring can, again, have those helpful variations in order to survive and reproduce. Okay, so number 5. Artificial selection is made possible by, sounds like a TV show. Artificial selection is made possible by A, humans, well, I guess the first one, humans, second one, environment, the organisms, or Darwin. What do we think? Well, we can kind of rule out one option. We can kind of rule out Darwin. Darwin studied natural selection, but I don't think he did anything with artificial selection. He was just there making notes of all his observations and getting some examples. So the artificial selection is made possible by humans. Again, trying to please the demands of the human population, whether it be dogs that have hair instead of fur, or crops that will produce more yield in order to feed all of the population. So artificial selection is made possible by humans. Number 6, Darwin voyaged on the HMS Beagle. True or false? What was the name of his ship he sailed? Darwin voyaged on the HMS Beagle, and that is definitely true. It is true. Okay, number 7. There are many variations in rabbit coloring, light and dark, within a desert population. Hawks prey upon the darker colored rabbits. What will happen to the population of rabbits over time? Okay, there will be more darker colored rabbits. There will be more lighter colored rabbits. There will be an even mix of dark and light rabbits, or color has no effect. Okay, so let's read this question again. There are many variations in rabbits, light and dark coloring. Hawks are going to prey on the darker colored rabbits. So the darker colored rabbits are being selected by prey. So what will happen to the population of rabbits over time? Well, if the darker ones are being eaten, that's more of an unfavorable trait. So the second option would be correct. There will be more lighter colored rabbits in the future. All right, number 8. If there were no birds or other predators in London, what would happen to the distribution of light and dark peppered moths? There would be more darker moths. There would be more lighter moths. There would be more of an even distribution of light and dark moths, or color doesn't matter. What do we think? If there were no organisms seeking out moths to eat for dinner, what would happen to the distribution of light and colored moths? Light and dark colored moths, excuse me. Any ideas? All right, so if there's nothing to feast on these moths, we would see more of an even distribution of light and colored moths, for sure. All right, so number 9, name 2 examples of artificial selection. Cows, dogs, produce, all of the above. what would be two examples, excuse me, two examples of artificial selection? Well, we talked about farmers and ranchers, talking about cows being reproduced to produce more milk. We talked about produce being reproduced to produce more of a yield. And then we also talked about dogs being artificially selected to meet the needs of the population in terms of being hypoallergenic. So number 9 would be all of the above. Got a few more questions. Okay, number 9, species produce more offspring than will survive to increase the chance that the best suited will survive and pass on those favorable traits. True or false? Species produce more offspring than will survive to increase the chance that the best suited will survive and pass on those favorable traits. True or false? So if you remember, this was the 5th principle. And some say that sometimes it's referred to as a principle or just implied. Excuse me. So this is true. Species are going to produce more offspring in hopes that the favorable traits, the more desirable traits will be passed on to their offspring. So number 10 is true. All right, going back to our familiar picture of bird eating beetles. So how does this image show natural selection? The brown beetles are better suited to the environment and will survive and reproduce, or the green beetles are better suited to the environment and will survive and reproduce. What do we think? Which ones, brown or green, are going to be better suited for the environment to reproduce? Well, these series of pictures are going to show us that the brown beetles are going to be better suited because they can blend in more, they can be camouflaged a lot easier than the green beetles. So the brown beetles are better suited to the environment and will survive and reproduce. All right, so number 12, we're talking about the rabbits in the deserts again. So there are many variations in the rabbit coloring light and dark within the desert population. This we know from the previous question. Hawks preyed upon the darker colored rabbits. Which rabbit was selected for survival in this environment? The lighter colored rabbits or the darker colored rabbits? Which rabbit will survive? Well, if the hawks prey on the darker colored rabbits, they're going to feast on the darker. That's going to leave the lighter colored rabbits camouflaging, being able to not be someone's dinner, and they are going to be selected for survival and able to reproduce. So in this particular situation, the rabbit that's selected for survival will be the lighter colored rabbits. Number 13, in species, there is no variations. I hope you all screamed false. Of course, there's variation. We, as humans, have different colored hair. We have different colored skin. We have different colored eyes, different shapes. Just within the human population, of course, in the species, there are variations. So this is definitely false. Number 14, what is a population? All the organisms in an area, all the members of a species living in a particular area at a particular time, the number of people, or all the species on Earth. What would be a definition for population? one that best describes a population is going to be all the members of a species living in a particular area at a particular time. Would be a wonderful definition of population. All right, so last but not least, number 15, dogs are an example of mutation, artificial selection, organisms, or evolution. Thinking about where the dogs came from, they all came from the wolf. And so over many, many, many years, humans have gotten involved and we have artificially selected the traits that we wanted passed on. So dogs are an example of artificial selection. Any questions over the Unit 5 review? Again, please make sure that you send me a text, send me an email, or send me a little chat. I'd be happy to go over this information with you with more detail. So don't forget, I'm here for you. And so always remember that your teachers care about your success. Okay, so going back to our presentation. Actually, so we talked about the elk antlers at the this refuge in Jackson. So let me go ahead and explain that a little bit better. So here we go. Here is an example of more of a chandelier antler. We have one that is perfect how it should be. This one probably got messed up in a fight when the elk was younger. So it kind of got moved a little bit, damaged a little bit when it was sparring with another elk. So it's a little crooked. The ladies aren't going to like that. They're not going to choose this particular elk for reproduction. Also, this one too, one of its antlers probably got knocked off again sparring. It's not gonna cut it. Let's see. So here are some beautiful elk with a nice symmetrical rack of antlers, and that's what the female cows are looking for to reproduce. Here's some budding antlers in velvet stage. Again, more antlers that are more symmetrical. Here's another example of a chandelier. Okay, again, when it was young, when its antlers were first developing, it probably got into a fight with another male, as male elk do, and it probably got kind of knocked off of its growth plate and started growing in a different direction. So here you can see a nice symmetrical rack. So just kind of another example of the favorable versus unfavorable. Here we have an unfavorable trait of a single antler. Okay. So again, very interesting. Here's another example of a chandelier. Here is a series of different bulls with their symmetrical antlers. So you can see that if you were a cow elk and you had to choose between a male with a nice symmetrical head of antlers versus one that was pointing to the ground and the other pointing up, we all know which one you would choose. So if you want to learn more about this, again, it's just the Elk Refuge in Jackson. These are made by the Flickr accounts on the Fish and Game Wildlife. So just kind of another example. So let's go back to the presentation and talk about some unit vocabulary. All right, so unit vocabulary. None of this would make sense if we didn't know what we were talking about, if we didn't know what the words meant. So again, reviewing, artificial selection is going to be a form of selection in which humans are going to actively choose which traits should be passed on. So If we want for dogs, for example, neither one of those dogs look like wolves, but over the time, humans have bred, it looks like a Great Dane for the size, for the long legs, for the size. And then humans over time have bred the wolf down to more of a cuddly little dog, lap dog. And then also you can see how corn would artificially be selected to yield more with crossing hybrids and all of that. Okay, so we have lineage. So lineage is the descent from an ancestor. You can look at your own lineage from going from your parents to your grandparents to your great-grandparents to your great-great-grandparents, okay? And then we can do that same thing with different, for example, dogs. We can trace their lineage all the way back to wolves. Natural selection. Here we have organisms with the best traits suited to their environment are going to be more likely to survive and reproduce. Again, talking about that example of London in the Industrial Revolution. Organisms with the best traits are going to reproduce, passing on those favorable traits. Okay, population, another very important vocabulary word. All the members of a species living in a particular area at a particular time. So again, talking about the different populations of Darwin's finches, each group of finches on each island would eventually have become their own population because they were all living in one particular area on one particular island at the same time. Okay, and variation. And there's always variation in species. So variation is going to be an inherited trait that makes an individual different from other members of their species. So color is one of the easiest to spot variations. So again, I would either say that those are Skittles or M&Ms or something. Their variation is obviously color. Each one is colored different. And then seashells are beautiful in their own rights, with each one being a little varied from the next. All right, I believe that is all for me. Do we have any final questions? Any questions over natural selection, or any questions over artificial breeding? Okay, if you think of any after this presentation is over, please give me an email, send me an email. I'd love to answer your questions for you, even if it's not about natural selection. I'm here to, again, make sure that you are successful, so I'm here to help in any way that I can. If you're working on an assignment that's a little bit more challenging than another, I'd love to help you with it. So yeah, always use your teachers. They're the best resources and they care greatly about you. So thank you for joining me today, and until next time, take care.